never come cheap, but you'll do just fine.
Hi everyone, we are back and you are in the right place here on the main stage. We have a really fun session coming up. Should be session of the day. We've got Erin Brockovich here, Michael Mann, who also has a great new book out, together with Ritholtz and Blair Palese. And we're going to have an open discussion. And we've got 55 minutes. We're running until 4:30. So the way this works is these guys will kick off the discussion, but then you all can engage and ask whatever questions you'd like. And we're going to come up with, Blair and the group will decide what the best questions are. And the 10 best questions are going to get a free signed book from either Michael Mann or Erin Brockovich. So I thought we'd make it a little fun. I'm going to now hand things over to Blair and Barry, and you guys can take it from here, and I'll sit back and enjoy. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Hi, Barry. Hi, Erin. Hi, Michael.
Hi, everyone.
Hey there.
Nice to meet you.
You too. It's great to have you two leaders together with two great books to be able to be with us, but also at this kind of pivotal point in time on climate change and recognition of science and all of the things you both have been working on for decades. I guess, opening up for those who don't know your books, a couple of seconds on why the book, what it focuses on, and, why people should go out and buy it right now.
Who wants to go first? Mike?
Sure. Well, let me first say that it's a real pleasure to be doing this event with you, Erin, and not just because it brings my Julia Roberts number down to 1, but in fact, because I'm a big fan of your continued environmental activism and how you've demonstrated that one person really can make a difference in the world. So thank you for that. Now, my book, The New Climate War, is sort of where we are. It's about where we are now in the climate battle. We're past denial. Climate change denial isn't tenable anymore because the forces of inaction that I call the inactivists in the book recognize that they can't get away with denying a problem that people can see with their own 2 eyes. And we're seeing the impacts of climate change now play out in real time. So instead, the inactivists haven't given up, the fossil fuel interests and those who promote their agenda, but they've engaged in an insidious array of other tactics in their efforts to keep us addicted to fossil fuels. That involves deflection from the needed systemic solutions and policies to individual behavior. As if it's just about you and me, we don't need regulations, we don't need carbon pricing, we don't need subsidies for renewable systemic change, or promoting false solutions like carbon capture and sequestration or geoengineering. Why don't we interfere with the global climate system in some other way in the hope that we somehow offset global warming? Anything that is an excuse for kicking the can down the road and allows polluting interests, fossil fuel interests, to continue to make millions and billions of dollars profits. And so we have to recognize these new tactics because we are so close to finally seeing the action that we've worked so hard for decades. We're that close, we can smell it, we can taste it, but we have to recognize that the forces of inaction are still out there. They're trying to get us fighting with each other. Division is another tactic that they use. Don't be fooled, keep your eye on the ball. Let's move forward. Let's solve this problem now. That's really the message of this book.
Quite interesting. There's a phrase I became familiar with a couple of years ago that very much applies to climate debate called agnotology. And what that is culturally constructed ignorance. And it traces all the way back to the tobacco executives who, if you remember the famous picture of all of them raising their hand, swearing before they testified, hey, the science is ambiguous. We don't know if smoking causes cancer. And it's amazing, having lived through that experience, to see the exact same thing play out with pollutants and fresh water and with climate science. The question I have for both Mike and Erin is, how do you deal with a nation that has been more or less gaslighted by the industry, and the science is unsettled. We'll just have to wait and see. Nobody really knows.
Well, Erin, of course, understands that very well. He's been fighting these battles for years now. Look, what we have to recognize is that there's a lot of bad faith in our public discourse today. And what you might think of as sort of what was a local cancer when it came to our discourse over climate change, when we were dealing with fossil fuel interests decades ago who were using that tobacco playbook and denying that climate change was real or a problem, while their own internal documents, ExxonMobil's own internal documents, contained words like catastrophic. That was their own scientists' characterization of the threat of climate change back in the early 1980s. And instead, of course, of coming clean, they spent tens of millions of dollars attacking independent scientists who were coming to the same conclusions that their own scientists had come to, that climate change is real, it's human caused, it's already a problem. And thanks to the success of that effort, we're decades farther down the road. We have a much steeper cliff to come down. If we are to limit carbon emissions below truly catastrophic levels, we have to act far more quickly now, because that was what the cost of that agnotology, the manufacturing of doubt and denial, that's the true cost. It's cost us decades, and we're too far down the road already. The good news here is that we are getting past the outright denial because people can see it's happening. But there still are those obstacles that I spoke of, and the bad actors, the fossil fuel interests, the front groups who do their bidding, the conservative media, and petrostates like Saudi Arabia and Russia are all working together to slow this transition down, because every year we remain addicted to fossil fuels, they continue to make millions and billions of dollars of profits. The problem is we can't afford that anymore. We've got to act now.
First, there was no such thing as climate change. Then, well, there are some signs of climate change, but it wasn't man-made. And then it became, well, maybe some of it's man-made, but it's going to be so expensive to fix. How do you respond to that progression where each of these losing arguments is just a delay for as long as possible before the next argument comes along?
Yeah, in a previous book I wrote with Tom Tolles, the former Washington Post cartoonist, The Madhouse Effect, we described this as the stages of denial. It's not happening to it's happening, but it's not a problem. To it's happening, but it's sort of a problem, but we can engineer our way out of it. We don't need to reduce carbon emissions and so on, because the bottom line, all they care about is that we remain disengaged. They don't care about the path we take to disengagement, whether it's because we deny that climate change is real or we think it's too late to do anything about it. Ironically, in either of those two cases, it feeds their agenda of inaction. And so we have to recognize that, because they're using these insidious narratives now to stall. Look, they know that we are going to leave the era of fossil fuels. It's coming to an end. The problem is they want to slow that transition down so much that we lock in truly catastrophic climate change impacts.
Quite
Erin,
interesting.
Can you see a lot of parallels, Erin, with the water? Some of the stuff you spoke in your last session about the shit show that's coming on water.
I'm sorry, I could have probably picked a better word.
No, that was
I'm just happy I didn't let an F-bomb fly. I'm sorry. Yeah, hi,
somehow,
Barry.
In parallel, you've got these two things happening, and both of you, have a historic view of how this has happened and what you have to overcome in order to call it out and see solutions. What's your take, Erin, on water in parallel with climate change?
Well, absolutely, there is one, and thanks, Blair. And Mike, I want to say hi to you, and I am definitely an admirer and a fan of all the work that you do and the persistence you've had on your climate message. So thank you. I don't know if you went off screen. I can't see you anymore. So, there you are. It's always good to have a point of reference. So thank you so much.
Likewise, right back at you, Erin. Thank you.
And, there is I've like been taking notes because I had so many things that I agree with, I wanted to share. And being a dyslexic, I'm visual. And I've often wondered about climate change and why there isn't the people always making a connection with what that is, because they think of it air and we can't always see it. And we get very busy in our lives, and the same thing happens with water. But I believe climate change is going to be a water event. And we're already seeing that happening, from the hurricanes to the storms to the excessive rain that we're watching right now in Australia, the flooding of, all the farms and all the pollution that runs off, to stifling water utilities, to not getting them back online, to, even what we saw in Texas. Let's talk about that ice storm and that type of climate. That's a water event. To the fact that there's less water, more droughts, and increasingly migratory pathways are going to start to change because there will be no water. I'm happy, though, and as Mike pointed out, that we're in that moment and discussion where we need to start having solutions and making at least plans for what we see coming. We're kind of in a moment. COVID shut us down. I think that has shown us the reset we needed, or the reboot that we needed, because we've all been very busy and this world was spinning around and we've been shut down. And as we wake up, one thing that came to my mind, and I do talk about this, believe it or not, again, in a visual, I believe more of us are visual. And when we see it, we get it. Knowledge is power. And then it clicks in our mind. So I talk a lot about the Wizard of Oz, and there's a whole political allegory to it. It's online. It's fascinating. But my point being is that moment where they're off to find the wizard, okay, that they get put to sleep in the poppy fields. As we're waking up, I'm wondering if we're running a parallel with that pre-industrial revolutionary time right now, and we are waking up. Whether we were comfortable, complacent, we bought an illusion. The point is, we're here now. And that is what's pivotal, is it's the people are showing up and we're shaking ourselves out and going, yo, what is going on up there? And the bigger message is people are now learning that who doubted themselves, you do have a brain, you have a heart, you have some courage, you see what's happening in front of you. And the time is now for us to act. I've often wondered when that moment would happen, and here we are. Because 30 years ago, it may have only been affecting a town like Hinckley, but now it's affecting towns everywhere. Now it's in everyone's backyard. Now this climate is showing up in everyone's backyard. And so we're ready to pick the ball up. I think that there is a huge parallel, and the climate change is climate change, and it's going to be a water event.
Can I extend Erin's metaphor a bit? Because I love that metaphor. One of the things we've done is to pull back the curtain on the denial machine. And moreover, what they learned, the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, the Cowardly Lion, learned at the end was that they had the tools all along. They had it within them. And that translates here in the climate arena, because we have the solutions already, renewable energy. We just need the commitment, the incentives to scale it up. Sorry, Bill Gates, we don't need a miracle. We've already got the solution. We don't need technology, additional technology to solve the problem. What we need is political willpower.
It's very true. And, it's humanness, and it's looking at human emotion and human behavior. And it's really looking back, and I've touched upon this before, this blanket of whatever it was has been very pushback, very, the voice isn't heard or the voice doesn't matter. And I think you've seen an explosion of that this past year. And it's something that we've discounted. and I don't think you can discount. I do think that when I talk about aging infrastructures, we have them. And I'm not just talking about aging infrastructures, aging and antiquated laws, policies, institutions that worked then, but we are different today. We are a bigger population, a bigger society. As we wake up, what that worked then is not going to work today. And how we come together so it does work moving forward. And I've always seen in my line of work a corporate model that pushed the can down the line. And if I could talk here for a minute about Pacific Gas and Electric, I've watched what happened in Hinkley with an antiquated infrastructure, and they were still, not up to speed on all of their systems. Some of their facilities are better now, but that settled at $333 million. Let's add defense costs, ongoing corporate cleanup costs, let's say $600 million. Then down the line, I found another case, Kettleman, that settled 10 years later for $335 million, same corporate books, cleanup for 50, 75 years, defense costs. We're well over $1 billion. And chasing that infrastructure up the California state line to an explosion in San Bruno, billions, to the latest fires that settled for $13.5 billion. Kicking that can down the line costs companies $50, $60 billion, a destroyed environment and lost lives and a potentially huge health implication. That's not working out. We need to switch on the upfront, doing it right, stop taking the shortcut, do the infrastructure, challenge the laws and the policies, health and safety, people first, and by God, you're going to save a lot of money down the line, and the environment and lives, and still make a profit. So when I think about that, I just feel like that's something we have to look at. It's not working anymore.
Right, and the economic arguments against action have got it completely backwards, as you just very nicely summarized, Erin. The cost of inaction is so much more now than the cost of taking action, and so we can't allow the critics to try to use economic arguments as if they are against acting on these crises, climate in particular. If you do the economics right, it's a compelling reason to act boldly and quickly.
Really interesting. We are getting questions fast and furious from the audience, so let me throw a few of these out. This comes from John, and I guess Blair is probably the target of this. How do you convince people there isn't a give up in terms of a performance boost based on a trade-off when people are making ESG investing? What is the point of reducing risk when you consider ESG factors? Does that make sense? How do you convince investors that they're not giving up performance?
Right now, there's so much evidence that investing. Yeah, I think there's every evidence that doing leads to better outcomes later. Michael, you probably have some thoughts too about how fast this is changing.
Mike, you want to take a swing at that? How fast what's the trade-off in terms of performance for investors who are looking for a more socially responsible or environmental tilt?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't my area of expertise, but I can just tell you as a person, as an individual, somebody who has, retirement funds, it's really important for us to recognize the fiduciary responsibility here on the part of fund managers. By investing in fossil fuels, not only is it a bad investment because ultimately they're going to have to leave their main asset stranded in the ground. That makes fossil fuels a bad investment. So even from a purely financial standpoint, fund managers investment firms, banks, financiers need to move away from fossil fuels from a practical standpoint. And that's not even accounting for the so-called physical risk. That's just the transition risk. We're going to have to leave those fossil fuels, their main asset, stranded. But even more than that is the fiduciary responsibility. Continued investment in fossil fuels is destroying the planet for future generations, for our children and grandchildren. And if fund managers are to recognize their fiduciary responsibility not to negatively impact their client, then they've got to stop investing in fossil fuels. And we've got to stop purchasing those stocks as well.
There's so many really fascinating questions come in. This is for either Erin or Michael. There's been a huge rise in food allergies. And by the way, this is from Barrett asks, there's been a huge rise in food allergies and sensitivities over the past 2 decades. They're wondering if any of the differences we're seeing has to do with environmental practices, pollution, or anything else.
Well, I'm going to say yes, because I'm one of those people that have had a lot of increased allergies. And I've noticed that because when I'm out in the field, I can get exposed to chemicals. I'm very allergic to sulfurs and sulfites, and that's in more and more of our food products, and it can be labeled differently. I think labeling is something important to look at, because I've seen that happen with chemicals in the marketplace. Like in Hinckley, the hexavalent chromium was labeled BETS 45, so no one knew what that was. People may read sodium dioxide and not know that that is, for people with sulfur or sulfite allergies, can be very deadly. So they have these secondary names on labels for what it really is, and people don't always know that. So I have definitely seen that increase. I've seen people reporting it to me. There's a couple of great books out there about environmental issues and food dyes, etc., and allergic responses. And let's not even talk about allergies. That's coming from an immune response. And it makes me think of the book that I was talking about with the lower infertility from one chemical. Not to mention, this one chemical has been shown in a few studies, one out of Harvard, to reduce efficacy of a COVID vaccination. So I think we need to skip back here and look at these pollutants and what it's doing to the endocrine system, the immune system, that can result in more allergies and possibly a less effective vaccination.
Interesting. This is for anyone who wants to answer it. We're in the middle of a pandemic and young people have been hit very hard. What would you say to them about standing up for something they believe in? Do little people still count?
I'm happy to kick off with how incredible the divestment campaign, for instance, largely driven by a lot of younger people. I think it's up to 15 trillion now moved out of fossil fuels. The Fridays for Future and Greta Thunberg, example of how in 1 year that young woman asking people to step up and get involved made such a difference worldwide. And her voice, her cut through ability to see that picture of what really is happening with impacts on climate change, cut through using Erin's, the shit show that's coming. She had just that ability as a young person to stand back and call out the obsequiousness of politicians going on and on about, we can't do that quickly, and just say, well, what about our future? It's my future. I'm not going to have one. I need you to step up and lead like you are supposed to be doing. So I'd say in many ways, younger people more than anyone at this point have such power and such an important role to play in calling out, if you will, the BS about, we can't do it, or it's just too hard or too expensive. We don't have a choice. We just don't have a choice anymore. If you believe in the science of things like COVID and the emergency response we needed to that, we need that, if not more, for climate change.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I just recently saw polling for the younger generations coming up that they were aware of COVID, but climate change was more of an important, or scared them more than COVID. So I think that, absolutely, they have a ginormous voice here, and they're finding it.
Mike, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I don't always quote the Bible, but when I do, it usually involves Greta Thunberg. And in my book, I do use the biblical quote, and a little child shall lead them. right? It's almost as if it was preordained that the voice of a girl who, at the time she started, she was 15 years old, I think, and she changed the world. And Erin is testament to that as well. One person can change the world for the better. And so this is a reminder, but coronavirus, it's a tragedy on so many levels. And yet, as we know, sometimes out of tragedy comes opportunity. And there is an opportunity, and Erin alluded to it earlier, for us to fundamentally rethink our values, our fragility on this planet, and the sustainability of our current practices. Now, the climate crisis, we have to act now, and we have to act within the system that exists while we act to change that system. But ultimately, we have to confront some larger questions about our sustainability on this planet and whether we can continue to live habitably on this planet with an extractionist economy. Let's try to have these conversations now, because I think the pandemic has opened our eyes, and it's opened up an opportunity for this conversation that we have needed to have for so long.
So, interesting question from Eric, because we've been talking a lot about fossil fuels, and Eric asks, many experts say animal agriculture is a larger contributor to climate change than burning fossil fuels. Should the transition to a plant-based diet play a larger role in our response to climate change?
I have some thoughts, and
I'll do.
I'm sure the others do as well. So this is a pet peeve of mine, and I talk about it in the book. Look, there's no silver bullet. There are carbon emissions across all sectors of modern life, and we have to rethink agriculture, animal agriculture. Fossil fuels, that's 70% of the problem. So getting off fossil fuels, that's got to be the primary focus. If you actually look at the numbers, when it comes to, for example, meat eating, it's only about 7% of our carbon emissions. And there's been some bad accounting that's been done that's gotten out there, this idea that more than half of our carbon emissions are from eating meat. Has to do with a misunderstanding about grass. The carbon that goes into grass that's eaten by cows actually came out of the atmosphere. So it's cycling that carbon. That isn't net carbon that's added. If you really look at the full cost accounting here, the careful numbers, it's about 7% or 8%. Total agriculture, more like 15 to 20%. So it's not the largest piece of the pie, but it is a piece of the pie. And what I say to people is, let's do all those things that we can do in our everyday lives to minimize our carbon footprint. They make us feel better about ourselves. They save us money. They set a good example for others. So I don't eat meat, and I get my energy from renewables only, wind-based power plan. I do all these things in my individual life to try to minimize my own carbon footprint. And I think we should set examples for others. We should all strive to do that. But let us not fall into the fallacy that alone is the solution. Polluters would love us to think that the solution simply involves our individual choices, but it doesn't, because we're locked in a system right now that is dependent on fossil fuels. And until we change that system and we decarbonize that system, we cannot ultimately solve this problem. So we need politicians, policymakers to put in place policies that will collectively move us away from fossil fuels, and quickly.
Anyone else?
Having a vegan diet was almost natural for me, because as I said earlier, I have so many food allergies. So dairy, cheese, all of that has always been out for me. I've definitely moved away from eating meat. And, the animal agriculture is something clearly that does contribute. It makes me think of the situation in Lake Okeechobee, and up from that, all the ag farming and animal agriculture farming, and the nitrates running off, the cow poop, let's be honest, what it is, and how that changes nitrification in Okeechobee and goes out through all these channels that creates these horrific, in part, toxic algal blooms that we're seeing down there that is suffocating the wildlife and the fish and damaging the entire ecosystem. So I think the CAFO farming, factory farming, animal agriculture has to be looked at because of pollution and runoff, what it does to the water and the entire ecosystem. Man's got to stop thinking he can beat nature. It makes me think, and I'm going to just read it right now. Rachel Carson from 1963. Man's attitude today towards nature is critically important simply because we have now acquired a fateful power to alter and destroy nature. But man is a part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war upon himself. We're challenged as mankind has never been challenged before to prove our maturity and our mastery, not of nature, but of ourselves. That's where we need to go. And we need to take a look at ourselves because we are not going to beat Mother Nature and this divine ecosystem, water system, climatic, the entire biosphere, and sit here and think that we can and just keep going and allow ourselves to destroy it. The question is we need to begin to look at ourselves. And I think we can start making changes there. And as Mike said, even with policies and our leaders, and we, the people, need to show up.
Blair, anything to add?
Just a quick one to say, look, we could all eat a lot less meat, and making a little bit of a difference makes a big difference on this issue. So just eating less, not ruling it out or being hard and fast. If you do that, you're doing fantastic, climate work, good for the planet work, but you're also looking after your own health. So I think it all ties together. The idea of overconsumption of everything's a bad idea. Let's put things in balance. Just as Erin said, really recognize that we're part of nature, and therefore that balance part is about how we live in it. And but the bigger picture, the bigger problem is our systemic use of fossil fuels. The faster we rid ourselves of that, the bigger effect we have on climate and other related, and so many impacts of oil spills and methane leaking due to fracking and the impact on water. It's just not working. It's time to fix it. There's great investment opportunities in the emerging climate economy. Let's just, wrap our arms around it and get to it.
That's a great point, Blair, because each person's individual action they think might not make a difference, but it does. And I've learned in my communities, in mathematics, 1 + 1 = 2. But in principle, 1 + 1 = 1,000 more. So even what little part that you do take as an individual, and every individual did, you could light up a lot of change.
Absolutely.
I agree with Blair on that.
And we don't get the policies we need if we don't get the politicians that we need. And so elections have consequences, and that is collective action, but it's a collection of individuals turning out, voting, and using their voice in every way possible to demand that our policymakers reflect and act in our interests rather than on behalf of the polluting interests.
So Nick asked the question, you mentioned Greta Thunberg, and Nick asked about Gen Z as a demographic. They're going to have to live with the mistakes of the past. But since you just brought up voting, let me add to Nick's question. Young people historically are not big at actually showing up and voting at the polls. We saw some signs in 2020. Maybe they're moving in that direction. So two-part question. What can Gen Z do the group that's following the millennials? And how do we get these folks to actually vote their own interest and show up at the polls?
I'm going to jump in there because I do see them, and then they're kind of showing up at local levels. So you have the overall federal, but boy, howdy, a lot of change can happen at your local level, city council, mayors, governors, and I do see them at a local level showing up and making their voices more heard there.
Yeah, and I do think they turned out in this last election, and climate was a major issue in this election. The Democrat, the Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, really did make it a focal point in his election. And that's the first time we've seen that in a presidential election. Even Barack Obama didn't really campaign on climate. I think that because there is so much passion and recognition on the part of younger folks about the climate crisis, thanks in part to the awareness that's been created by Greta Thunberg and the youth climate marchers and protesters around the world, there is this awareness. And when you campaign on climate, you bring out new voters. And that's what Democrats saw in this last election. You can expand the pie. You can bring out new voters who had remained on the sidelines, but did come out because suddenly this election was about something that mattered to them.
Yes.
Really?
And I did, again, pay attention to your local state elections as well. You know, PFAS, we'll talk about that real quick. You've got a federal oversight at 70 parts per trillion, but state by state, due to increased pollution and finding these locations and people's concerns, they're bringing levels down to 10, to 7, to 5. And so you can make effective changes in your own backyard at a local level too. And it's fun to see them show up because they are.
Absolutely.
This is an interesting question, and it's addressed to everybody. How much did you love the book The Water Knife by Paolo, I'll mangle this last name, Bacigalupi? What role does fiction have in changing people's minds about the severity of climate change, and is there any fiction any of you want to recommend?
Well, I'm happy to start off here because I actually did an event with Kim Stanley Robinson just a few weeks ago, Ministry for the Future. And it's a wonderful futuristic novel, but not in the far future. I mean, it's more or less about where we are and where we're going over the next couple decades. And what I like about it is that we encounter way too much doom and gloom, dystopian sort of narratives about our climate future. And that can be disabling. If you really feel that there's nothing we can do, it can lead you down that same path of disengagement as outright denial, as I said before. And what I love about Stan's new novel is that it envisions, it's not Pollyannish. I mean, we're going to have to go through a lot of really difficult stuff, and there is going to be damage along the way, and there's going to be loss of life along the way. There already is. Dangerous climate change has arrived. If you're Puerto Rico, if you're a low-lying island nation, if you're California, the West Coast, Australia, you name it, dangerous climate change has arrived. So we're not going to avoid the danger. It's already here. But there is still the possibility of a future where we do ultimately address not just the climate crisis, but these larger questions about sustainability and justice and equality. And so it is possible to imagine a good future where people prosper and we do find a way to live sustainably on this planet. And we need those narratives. It isn't false hope, it's real hope. And we have to make sure that people have it.
Anyone else have a book they want to suggest that might be worthwhile in the fiction realm?
I was going to also say Kim Stanley Robinson, because I think that may be the most current, kind of right up to the minute of where we are right now, and the potential, the real need to work globally to find the solutions. But knowing that will come with pitfalls of the way humans work. But it ends. I think it's worth a read. It's got a great ending. He's actually speaking at our Sydney Writers Festival in the next few weeks. So I think big pile on to hear him talk about that. But I guess it's a real genre now, and there's lots of great new writers coming out, younger writers as well. So keep an eye. I think it's as Michael said, it's a way to envision the positive future potentially versus just the doom and gloom. And when we can find those positive ones, then we should all share them and make sure we're all giving them a big boost.
I agree, both with Blair and Mike, and it envisions and it creates, as we were kind of talking, that visual for them that is something that isn't just dark and gloom and doom. And because when you hear it a lot, you're like, well, I'm just going to go for it now because I'm not going to be here tomorrow anyway. And I think there's other ways, through that type of writing that it can open up minds and different hope and optimism. And that's really important. And I hadn't read the book yet, so my apologies.
Very, very interesting. This question comes from John. What can be done about, really broadly, transportation, travel, container ships? How significant of an issue is this? We have to move people and things from place to place, and most of these transports use really dirty fuel. And since they're in the open oceans or skies, very often it's not charged to any one country and beyond regulation. What should be done about this?
Blair, did you want to?
Just green hydrogen looks like a real possibility for
Yes.
particularly shipping and airline
Flights, yes.
travel fuel. Early days, lots to be done, but in a funny way, it could lead us to ramping up renewables at a really fast and large scale. And maybe that's the trigger we need. If we want to look to no carbon travel, we're going to have to think pretty big and out of the box. And there are a lot of mainstream industrial developers now who think green hydrogen is the way to go. So keep an eye on that one. I think it's got big potential, and probably what will drive it is the need for solutions on transport. Mike, you might talk a little bit more about the science side.
Yeah, no, the only thing I'd add to what Blair said, which I agree with completely, is that, there's a tendency for us sometimes to focus on the really difficult to decarbonize sectors of the economy, air travel, for example, or cement production. We don't really have technology yet that allows us to decarbonize some of those sectors. Although there are ways to be much more carbon friendly in cement production. There are new biofuels that are being developed, high capacity batteries. So that's where continued research and development is important. We do need to still work on the technologies that'll make it easier to decarbonize those sectors. That having been said, the vast majority of our fossil fuels are in sectors where we do have the potential to decarbonize now. We have to electrify things, then we have to decarbonize the grid. And when we decarbonize the grid and we electrify all of our appliances and our vehicles and our infrastructure, again, keep your eye on the ball. That's the lion's share of the carbon emissions. Let's continue to work on the more challenging sectors and again, do the research and development, but don't let that be a distraction from doing the decarbonization now that we can achieve.
And very interesting.
Yep.
John asks a question, and I'm going to add to it. He asks, what role does nuclear energy have in addressing climate change? And I'm going to add, I don't know, maybe it was 10 or 15 years ago, there was a lot of buzz about thorium reactors, which is a smaller nuclear reactor that apparently doesn't create the same highly radioactive waste. So is nuclear a viable option? And what about some of the more modern forms of nuclear energy?
Mike, you?
I'm happy to make a few comments. I'm interested in the other perspectives as well. I think the fascination with thorium is mostly because of the Marvel character Thor. No, I'm just kidding. It has nothing to do with that whatsoever. But this idea that small modular reactors might be a viable way of scaling nuclear technology, because the problem is these huge nuclear power plants require massive amounts of government infrastructure, government investment and subsidies. And so this idea to make it more competitive, to focus on these smaller modular reactors, but they don't escape the concerns about nuclear proliferation or nuclear radiation. And so, if you look at Bill Gates' recent book, for example, he is rather dismissive of the potential for renewable energy. I think overly dismissive. I think he ignores the literature that says we can get there with renewables. And by so doing, it forces him to then find some other riskier strategies to achieve climate mitigation. And that includes geoengineering, which is very scary to me. I think that's the wrong path to go down. And nuclear. And it comes with real risks. We know that, and risks that aren't present with renewable energy. So, I think we should continue to have that conversation. I think there's a role at the table for advocates of nuclear as a potential part of the climate solutions. But I think we have to very carefully take into account the risks that are involved and the economics, because nuclear isn't even competitive with renewable energy right now. So if you're arguing this for economic reasons, it doesn't make sense. Nuclear requires massive government subsidies. So if you're a free market libertarian, then it makes no sense that you should be arguing for nuclear energy, although many of them do, because it's actually inconsistent with the very economic philosophy you espouse.
No, very, very well said, Mike. And, I work in and around nuclear issues, and I don't know that the science is always caught up with that scenario and populations and children and communities that are sick. If there is an accident or a situation, we're going to have a major problem. So it is something that you watch. I watch other countries closely. I believe Switzerland will have it all phased out by 2040. I could be off on that date, but again, it's a conversation to be had. There's, I guess, pros and cons. And for me, it's looking at what these nuclear facilities in and around communities are doing and the health impacts that we're starting to map and study more and more, and the risk. Something goes wrong, it's going to be bad.
Yeah, just quickly, most expensive energy in the world, and it comes with, it's uninsurable. It's linked to weapons. That was the main driver in the early stages. When you're looking, you pull back and look at energy, to my mind, there's just nothing there to it that looks appealing. When you've got the potential for renewables, battery storage, and how you can distribute that, make it at low cost, you can build it and use it where you need it. It just doesn't make it, that sort of big monstrosity energy monster, even micronukes, it's still a big infrastructure, any kind of nuclear energy setup. So I can't see it, but I think Mike and Erin are being generous in saying, let's keep the discussion going. I'd say let's just shut that down and move on, but open.
I'll be honest, Blair. I say put it on the table because it might bring some people to the table. But we're probably going to want to take it back off the table.
I think you're right.
So we haven't talked about oceans, and Thomas asked a really interesting question. How do we combat ocean acidification, which is destroying coral reefs around the world? And what can we do about plastics, how it affects our seafood source? What are the ramifications of all these problems for our food supply in the future?
I can do a short take on that, but Erin, you might want to jump in on the water side. But, absolutely great question, Thomas, because the integration of ocean protection, sustainable blue economy, climate change, that kind of more complex thinking about the bigger problems, how they're integrated, how we find solutions to all of them is really, really important. And for investors, it's kind of also, a whole new world of opportunities. But Michael or Erin, you might talk about acidification. It's a huge problem and another reason to tackle climate change. And plastics, boy, systemic, huge issue. It's time to get on top of that one. There are people doing great, use of old ocean plastic for products and stuff, but that doesn't bring us back right up the back end of the chain, which is to say we have to cut off the huge quantity of plastic we're making and the dumping of it. All these things are together, right? If we are able to solve climate change, we should be able to address ocean pollution and think about these systemic problems and the impacts they're having.
Mm-hmm.
Erin, you want to jump in on water?
No, I completely agree. I mean, first of all, again, here I go with my visual thing. The ocean, if you see, all of the ocean and the rivers and the creeks and the tributaries from above, it looks like the human body. And it looks, all the rivers, creeks, and tributaries are your vein. And that ocean is your heartbeat. And that ocean is something we got to protect. And climate change is affecting it, and bleaching of the coral reef, the pollution that's affecting it. I am seeing, though, just a large mass moving around the plastics, how we stop it, coalitions, networks, groups, whether it be Florida, California, Australia. They're out, they're on the beach, they're making sure these plastics aren't entering the water. Programs to, when you dispose of it, how you cut, the 6-pack can things so it wouldn't get around a turtle. I'm seeing an explosion of this. And I agree with what Blair said. We address climate change, we address these pollution issues, we save our oceans. But it is a big topic. And for anyone that isn't interested, I just want you to think of it as your own heart. It's our heart. It's our heartbeat. And we keep doing what we're doing and clogging up our arteries and suffocating our air and not moving towards a climate change. There's just going to be a massive heart attack. But it has warmed my heart, and I work with groups all over that are dealing with the plastics, how to stop it, doing with the wildlife. I work with the Irwin's Foundation in Australia, and the turtles, the education. Again, this is education, conversation, information. Knowledge is power. It's affecting more and more people. They're stepping up to the plate, and they're making that change. It won't happen overnight, but it is definitely a ginormous problem. But going back to what Blair said, each little component of everything we've talked about, we have to take action and reduce that. And we can see a better effect for our oceans. Shit show without it. Don't know what to say.
So you mentioned all the little pieces adding up. Our final question will go to Christian, who asks, what do we need to do to avoid the tipping point cascades? What's left in our carbon budget? Any chance that we'll stay below a 2-degree centigrade increase off in the future? Or, as Erin says, are we looking at a shit show?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I'll field that one first because it is a climate-themed question. And, the reality is that we can still prevent a catastrophic 2-degree Celsius, nearly 4-degree Fahrenheit warming of the planet. And we know that if we warm the planet beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius and then 2 degrees Celsius, we really start to see some of the more dangerous and catastrophic impacts of climate change and irreversible impacts of climate change. So there is no one tipping point. It's like a dangerous highway that we're going down. And if we miss the 1.5 degrees Celsius exit, which is possible, we still want to get off at the next exit, the 2-degree exit. The farther we go down that highway, the worse it gets. So we can. The good news about the science, the latest science tells us that if we stop putting carbon pollution into the atmosphere, the warming of the surface of the planet basically stabilizes within the next few years. So there is a direct and immediate impact of our effort to reduce carbon emissions. We can still keep warming below these catastrophic levels, but it's going to require, if we want to get on that path to 1.5 degrees Celsius, limiting warming below that, roughly 3 degrees Fahrenheit, we've got to bring carbon emissions down by a factor of 2 within the next decade. That means we've got to cut them as much as we did during the pandemic, which was 7%, but we've got to do another 7% next year, another 7% the next year, and beyond. And what that means is voluntary measures and changes in behavior alone aren't going to get us those reductions. We need to decarbonize our civilization and on a schedule of the next decade or so.
Hear, hear.
Oh, I'll hear it. I just wish I could, come up with something more than the you-know-what show, but sometimes it's just, I don't know how else to say it, but yeah, because these are big asks and big goals and big gains. But again, because the people are showing up, that, a lot's been absent from the table. The biggest part has been the people, and they're showing up. And for me, if you want to send a message of hope, there it is. Show up. That's one of the best things that we can do is just show up. Show up to the conversation, show up to the table, show up with some actions. And don't ever think that somebody else is doing it for you or assume that it's being taken care of, because I think we clearly see it's not.
Amen.
Amen.
Hear, hear. What a great session. That was really, really fun. Thank you all for coming in and doing this. And I would urge everyone who didn't win a book tonight by asking a question to go out and buy Michael Mann's and Erin Brockovich's books. If you did, just we think we kept track of everyone, but please send me a note. Just send it to me, jim@sparknetwork.com, and we'll make sure that you get your signed books. This was really an amazing event, top to bottom. I got to check out all the different sessions, and if you didn't get to check out the different sessions, it will be on demand within the next week or two. So keep your eyes open at sparknetwork.com, and you can see all that great content that maybe you missed some of. So that really is about it. I'd like to just thank the team at Spark Network, Elizabeth and Corey and Connor and Alicia, and Nick, who all work so hard, the guys at Climate and Capital Media Group, Blair, who woke up at 4 a.m. today, really helped us put together some amazing content together with Peter and their team. Like to thank again all the sponsors who came in, Morningstar, State Street, iClima, Ethic, who else do we have? And all the rest of you who we have branding on the website for. And the next event is going to be for us. We're actually doing a Bogleheads event on April 10th that anyone's welcome to come to. And then we're doing ETF.com Awards April 20th, which will have the Winklevoss twins speaking at. So I guess if I could just leave everyone with some words of hope, I think that's the thing that struck me most, particularly about Michael Mann's comments, is that there is a lot of hope here. And in driving towards zero carbon, there also is a huge amount of opportunity. You look at all the exciting companies that are working toward decarbonization, and I just think it's a huge investment opportunity, and it's an opportunity to hand a better planet to your kids. So I think all of us can play a part in that. So once again, thanks to all of you for attending. Thanks to everyone who helped with the event. Really enjoyed this myself. I hope you have as well. Thanks to Nick and the musicians, and we'll be back with more soon. Thank you all.